nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.
All right, welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. I'm your host, 2 Black. First, want to apologize for them not being on this last month. It wasn't really due to not trying, or just really had some bad scheduling, among other things that I won't get into, but there was just some bad scheduling. So the things we had planned last month did not happen, so we had to kind of reset. So I apologize, and the whole crew apologizes. You know, people get married on our show, and you know, there's other stuff going on and it's not working into. So just do want to apologize for not, being present. Same time, appreciate all the patrons who have still signed up despite our absence. I do want to shout them out. It is Jordan Davis, Matt Esperanza, Natalie Hunter Young, Edison, Renita James, Scott Siegel, Zarek, and then Eric Cuthbert. I hope I'm saying that correctly. I believe they upgraded. So I want to shout out all the patrons who still came through despite us being on not really any kind of sabbatical or break. Like, we did research for episodes. It did not happen. So it's been but it is what it is. So we're back. So today's myth is the end of history, which I'm sure most people of a certain age are not familiar with that phrase whatsoever. But I explained it a little bit in the interview, so I won't say too much here. But overall, it's just this idea that after the fall of the Soviet Union, liberal democracy and capitalism had won, and the claim was that anything that any kind of governmental issue, state issue, anything that could be handled by liberal democracy and capitalism, and communism had lost, fascism had lost, as in like they had lost as systems that people as a whole across the world should be practicing, and capitalism and liberal democracy had won as the mainstay. It had won the question on civilization. So the end of history was there would be no more struggle about what government and more broadly the state should look like. And this was in 91. This was written. It was actually in a book called "The End of History and the Last Man," and written by Francis Fukuyama. So again, I state more about this in the episode. And you might be asking, like, what does this have to do with Black people, or what's the relationship to this kind of show? But again, it's this idea that basically Western civilization under capitalism and liberal democracy, that is the way that everyone needs to go. So anyone who wants to be a government, you see this with particularly places in the global South where a lot of Africans and people of color, colonized folks exist, that, they need to have more democracy, they need to implement this kind of government. And if not, then they're considered something bad, dictatorship, socialist, whatever. But as we showed, liberal democracy really doesn't win. You see escalation of wars, you see financial collapse. So we found this document by Tricontinental Institute, which is a think tank that produces research primarily on the left, a Marxist think tank, and they have this document that they created, pretty long document, but a great read, called Hyper-Imperialism, and it talks about this escalation of imperialism even beyond maybe what someone like Vladimir Lenin talked about or anything of that nature, and how, and they open up in this document talking about the end of history, or this idea of the end of history. Now actually there's a counter narrative to that, like history did not end. Liberal democracy has not solved the problems of civilization. It has not solved the problems, particularly of, colonized people of color, etc. Definitely not Africans, definitely not Black folks, whether that's within the imperial core of the United States or even outside of it. So they just put this out earlier this year, I believe in like February or January. So we went to talk to one of the researchers from it, Mikaela Nhondo Erskog. She was on She was on. If for those long time listeners, y'all remember the myth that China was colonizing Africa, which that episode still gets brought up to this day, even though it's 3 years old. And she came on to debunk that and did a great job, laid out the research, laid out what China's activity was in Africa and what it wasn't, what criticisms did exist, but how that was not equivalent to colonizing. So it's interesting today we're talking about imperialism, which is like the next step of colonialism, and hyper-imperialism and what it looks like in this stage. So I'm glad to have her back. It's been several years again since she's been on. I always appreciate her work. Definitely appreciate the work that she put in on this hyper-imperialism document. So we're going to be using that to debunk this idea of the end of history and this last man idea, that the United States primarily is the leader of this end of history, and this becomes a unipolar world where the United States doesn't have to compete with the Soviet Union or anybody else. They get to make all these decisions. And since that moment has happened, the United States has, just plundered the world with more wars and created more conflict. And when other countries rise, it wants to poke the bear with them too. So we deal with that again to primarily demonstrate, what we're really up against. I guess at the end of the day, like, what does it mean when one nation leads the entire global north and is also slipping in its power and its control? Like, what does that mean for the rest of us on this planet? That is the primary question, or the primary interest in this myth, and just the arrogance of the West to say that since they think they won something, that is the end of history. So anyway, we're gonna get into it. This is a two-parter, so there will probably be an episode for the next 4 weeks. I hope there will be at least one episode just to kind of make up for lost time, and maybe even more. Might even be able to check us out on BPM. We might do a live or something just to kind of debrief on some of this stuff, just to catch up for lost time again. So I want to say one last time, I appreciate everybody for sticking with the show. It's been a lot going on. The book came out. It's been a lot going on. But again, the goal was to stay on schedule, so we apologize. And we still owe y'all a third part of an episode on the book Launder and Black Rage to talk about cities. So be on the lookout for that too. But anyway, without further ado, gonna get into the episode. Yeah, hope y'all appreciate it. Hope y'all enjoy it. Thanks for being here with us. Would you mind introducing yourself and speaking a little bit about this hyper-imperialism document that you were a part of and within the broader collective of Tricontinental?
For sure, thanks. Nice to be on again many years later. My name is Mikaela Nhondo Erskog. I'm a researcher and editor at Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. I'm also involved in Pan-Africanism Today, which is the regional articulation of the International People's Assembly, which brings together all sorts of progressive movements, trade unions, women's groups, peasant groups, political parties, trying to kind of build internationalism, working class internationalism from below, from, living, breathing organizations that have a mass base. And I also work I'm on the coordinating committee of No Cold War, which is a peace platform that basically tries to shed light on what really is the geopolitical situation we're in right now, and the fact that this is a US-led attack against what the US sees as its threats to its, political, economic hegemony, which is primarily China. Of course, Russia fits in, and many other countries in the global south, which is part of the document or the content of the document we're going to talk about. And yeah, I'm really glad to get this time to talk to you about it, because even though I was one of the I authored parts of it, I did a lot of editing, I worked with a big team of people, I'm also working in a group called Global South Insights, which is trying to use, because on the left and in progressive circles, a lot of the time we have all the great good theory, good ideas, but not necessarily always the latest data and have it very much, based in fact. And actually, I think it was Deng Xiaoping said you have to seek truth from facts. Like the Marxist way, the revolutionary way is to seek truth from the facts. So what we're doing in Global South Insights, GSI, is we're trying to collect, World Bank data, IMF data, you name it. Now we're working on a project with, the Food and Agriculture Organization data, trying to put it in one place and trying to support researchers in Tricontinental when they're doing their research. And what we have in the document is some of our preliminary fact findings, as well as, I think, we generally also wanted to almost create a reference document that had a lot of collective inputs, not only of people in Tricon and GSI, but of movement leaders from, whether it's the MST, the Landless Workers Movement in Brazil, whether it's like African trade union leaders. We really got a lot of input from people across the world. And so sometimes the document can read a little bit staccato, and it's because we had a very rich contributions from a wide collective of thinkers and socialist practitioners, let's say. That's the one. The second is the driving reason, and we start the document off with military spending, is because we had a concern, and in Tricontinental we have this concern, is that whilst the objective reality is that the Global South, largely because of China's rise, now represents a bigger share of the world economy, now represents, are more visible in certain international political spaces, are developing new joint projects like the expansion of BRICS, the Friends in Defense of the United Nations Charter, all of those kinds of emergent groupings that are changing the international geopolitical landscape. We still didn't want people to be deluded by the fact that in pure military terms, the US, which leads an integrated military bloc, has in 2022 has 74, almost 75% of global military spending. The US alone, which is around, this was 2022, and actually it would be slightly higher, but at the time we were doing the calculations, which is not just the kind of Stockholm Institute numbers. The Stockholm Institute reported for 2022, around 800 billion. But they didn't take into account other factors such as, for example, veterans budgets are counted in China and when they're counting the Chinese budget, but they don't count other areas in which money is spent on that will go to the military, like the energy sector. Some of the energy needs of the military aren't calculated by Cyprian, and a few other factors, but they calculated around 800 billion was the number for 2022. And we counted that, and this is the work of John Bellamy Foster and Gisela Cernadas, which if you want a shorter article, it's there in Monthly Review. They calculated that the actual true military spending is closer to 1.5 trillion US dollars. So that's almost double.
Yeah.
Yeah, almost double. So the US alone spends that amount of money. The US, if you count the rest of NATO and other non-NATO but US allies, you basically come to I forget the round number, but of the 2.8 trillion US dollars that's spent, they spend 75, almost 75% of global spending. And the next budget is around, China is at 10% of world spending. So there's also an important thing was we didn't want to underestimate the fact that the US has this huge military apparatus that comes from a historical place that we tried to outline, but two, that you can't compare it as an equal China versus the US, war, when the US far outweighs Chinese spending. I mean, in terms of global average per capita or global average, the US spends 12.6 times higher than the global average. And China is around, I think, 0.8, something like that, if I'm not mistaken. So we just wanted people to get a real sense that this is not like an equal weighted war.
Russia's only at, on your pie chart, is only at 3%. I just want people to get a sense of, you have the United States.
It's only at 3%.
Yeah, United States, again, is just for people who are so clear, as US-led, the US military bloc controls 74% of military spending globally. And then you have China at 10%, and Russia's only at 3%. But the way it's presented is that there's these equal powers. Like even for people on the left, there's this idea that there's this inter-imperialist war, which is another thing that you all get at, that there are no inter-imperialist wars. So the myth I chose was like the end of history, which, you know, those of us who are younger may don't even know what that means. But there was a book that came out. It was actually originally an essay that then became a book in 1991, shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union. It's called The End of History and the Last Man by Francis Fukuyama. And it basically makes this argument that, you know, the world has tried communism, particularly through the Soviet Union. It's tried fascism, and his inception of it, as far as when you're talking about Germany or Italy under Mussolini and Hitler, and it's defeated those. Those have all been defeated. Fascism has been defeated. Communism has been defeated. And capitalism under liberal democracy emerges as the end of history, in the sense that it has solved the question of civilization and has solved the question of what we should all be working towards. He said, quote, "Liberal democracy replaces the irrational desire to be recognized as greater than others with a rational desire to be recognized as equal. A world made up of liberal democracies then should have much less incentive for war, since all nations would reciprocally recognize one another's legitimacy. Reciprocally, recognize one another's legitimacy." So it comes out of this sense that, you know, and this is written right after the fall of the Soviet Union. So the end of history, I think, is, you know, very arrogant claim. And this is not actually a white man that said this. It's also interesting when you look up who Francis Fukuyama is. But it becomes captured by a lot of Western imperialists, Western philosophers, and it's this idea again that history has been won. Like there's not really anything to battle over. Liberal democracy, he talks about, is not perfect, but whatever contradictions emerge, whatever issues emerge, liberal democracy is what has the capacity to solve it under capitalism. And all these other things, the Soviet Union, communism practiced by anyone else. At the time, I think he was looking at China as moving in a more Western-based, kind of like a market economy anyway. All of these things prove that, you know, that this is the end. So not that history is literally over. That might be how some people read it, but that the challenges of world civilization is over. Like we simply just need to work within the framework that is quote unquote one. So you all open with a kind of shot at this idea. You say, and this is in the introduction of Hyper-Imperialism. "It has been a scant 30 years since the end of history was declared by bourgeois ideologists in a pandemonium of wish fulfillment for sensing the inviolability of United States imperialism. For people's struggles and movements filling the boot of imperialism on their necks, they're feeling the boot of imperialism on their necks, no such end was in sight." So, and then you go on to reference the different struggles that people have had to engage in, and also the different wars that have been launched, and how, in many ways, you know, in 91, even when we go back to 91, you're thinking about that's when the United States gets in conflict with Saddam Hussein the first time. You know, it's when it starts carving up the countries from the Soviet Union. You know, that's when, I mean, we think about I have another interview coming up tomorrow about the Rwandan genocide that occurs just 3 years after this statement was made, and so on and so forth. So what is the end of history? I guess just to kind of sum it up, how do you understand it? And within the kind of Tricontinental framework, how do you all understand this claim of the end of history? Like, what does that ultimately come to mean?
Sure. So you already mentioned, I think, partially answered in the sense that, one, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's like he's saying that, well, there's nothing that the US can't defeat. One is that the US is invincible, essentially, and the US led financial policies and economic and political hegemony, it can no longer be challenged, that no alternative would ever emerge that could challenge it. That's one. But two, I think and for us who work with social movements and people's organizations, as he's saying that, there are struggles for sovereignty, struggles for dignity unfolding across the world. I mean, one of the early examples we share was around Latin America and the rise of Hugo Chavez, where essentially he begins the process of, at a time in which Cuba is really struggling. They're going through the special period in the 1990s after decades of sanctions and various forms of hybrid warfare and economic embargoes. But we see that there's like a popular movement behind Hugo Chavez that inaugurates a new process of people's organizations lobbying for a different alternative. We see the emergence of ALBA Movimientos, which is the coordination of Latin American progressive states, who are essentially thinking, how can we better define and self-determine the various projects in our countries? How can we actually deal with the issues of hunger, of poverty, of lack of education? And this is happening again across the world in different moments. I mean, a few years after he's saying this, we're having the Nepali overthrow the monarchy. So the way we see it, and because we come from it from a historical, dialectical, materialist form of examination and analysis, is that things are always in motion and people are always going to struggle to better their lives. And at the time, I mean, I think the economists like John Ross, who studies China very closely, who more or less at that time, and many, many others, saw what was, and had followed the process in China, and saw that the opening up period from the early 1980s in China was actually, in that moment, the correct move to make, because if China was going to grow, it needed to interact with the rest of the world. It needed to increase its economic activity, and you can't do that in isolation. And sadly, we live and operate in conditions not of our making. So, right. We still have to operate.
Yeah, they needed. They needed capital to build up their own productive capacity. Talking about China. Yeah.
Yeah. So people had already, those who had followed China closely and had a correct analysis, were saying that in a matter of decades, we're going to see China rise just because of the scale of its people, its population, its resources, its territory. And so even though it marked a defeat for the Soviet Union in that moment, there was still embryonic processes happening, not only amongst people's movements across the world. I mean, the MST is founded in the late 90s, and it's one of the largest peasant organizations in the world, representing over 1 million landless workers. But shortly after that, we get to 2008, where the bubble bursts on the economic model that was ultimately always going to be unsustainable. And we basically periodize that the hyper-imperialist stage starts from that 2008 moment, because it's clear that the economic model doesn't work. And when it does, in quotes, work, it benefits an elite. From that period, we've only seen increasing inequality in the world. We've only seen increasing poverty. We've only seen increasing ecological disasters and crises. And by 2009, of course, it's with the emergence of the Tea Party, we're also seeing that there's an internal fracturing in, the US's domestic policy, that it's not just the whole elite is marching in step with one another. The US, you guys were at that moment, are also struggling with internal divisions on who should be in power. And so the thing of the end of history is just anti-materialist, it's anti-historical. It doesn't understand that there's always going to be a push and a pull. And sometimes it's pulling in one direction harder than the other, but it can as easily move to the opposite direction if the correct conditions, objective and subjective, are in place. So we also did want to kind of reflect on that moment and do so by not just saying that, well, 2008 happened, the US has been slowly losing its kind of economic strength and hegemony, but also grounded in the fact that the people are always going to fight for a better alternative. We might not always be as organized as we should be. We might not always be as informed about what's the best way to do it, but humankind is always going to try to improve their situation. And that was the case at the time in the 90s.
Thanks for that. When it comes to the collapse of the Soviet Union, that was a historical moment. So why was the collapse of the Soviet Union such a monumental world event, and what did that represent to for the United States, I should say? Because I think some of us aren't familiar with what that, especially those of us who are younger, we don't know. We didn't live through the Cold War. We have no sense of it in many cases. So what did that represent for the world, and particularly for the United States?
Well, at the time it was essentially, so there was supposedly a fight over bipolarity, but what isn't seen is that the Soviet Union, with all its problems and contradictions, with all its, it had different failures in policy, you always have to experiment and because we don't know until we're doing the thing.
Right.
But the Soviet Union at the time, aside from representing the kind of communist enemy, ideologically, it also represented a challenge to Western domination of the entire globe. It also, the Cold War, in many ways, sometimes this image of bipolarity makes it seem like nothing was happening in the other continents, like we were all sleeping whilst it was happening. But it's at the height of the Cold War is during the phase of the national liberation struggles, where across the world, we are having different people say, listen, we've been under the boot of colonialism for far too long. We want to self-determine. And seeing the possibilities that started with the Russian Revolution in 1917, a lot of people were inspired by that, from Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam to Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau to the Cubans and Fidel, etc. in the 1950s. And so there is a global mood and appetite and energies for self-determination. The Soviet Union becomes not only the political reference because it was able to produce new processes that we hadn't seen, new social relations we hadn't seen, but of course it gave a lot of material support to a lot of national liberation struggles.
Right.
And a lot of political support. I mean, the South African Communist Party, which was formed in 1921, most of the leaders, were formed under the auspices of the Comintern, what some people call the Third International or the Communist International, where there were people who were thinking, what is an alternative way of living and being and developing? And at the time, the ideas around communism were appealing to a lot of people because it had its roots in the masses, and it had its roots in trying to deal with people's problems as a whole and as the majority. So, during the Cold War period, with the defeat of the Soviet Union, it does represent a significant loss, even though there were a lot of problems and contradictions in the late period of the Soviet Union. But it also, in terms of technological development, scientific development, represented a defeat in terms of the hegemony of the US. Because at the time, then, the US becomes the leading, scientific and technological production site. And all of that is very much, behind the patents, behind the intellectual property rights that only serve to benefit the elites of the Western countries. So we mentioned this in the text, that I think it was, when was it? I have to think about this carefully, but it was, oh, right, I got it. When the Russian Revolution happened, and around almost just over 3 months after the revolution began in October, Lenin went out into the snow and apparently was celebrating because the Russian Revolution had outlasted the Paris Commune, which was a revolt against the bourgeoisie in France that lasted around 3 months in 1870. And he celebrated. In 2021, wait, I have to find this. Give me 1 second.
I know what you're referring to. You're talking about Xi Jinping.
Yes, that in November of last year, quietly, it wasn't like a big public thing, but quietly, people were celebrating that the People's Republic of China, which had now existed at the time in November, I think it was the 18th of November, had lasted for, I think it's like 27,000 days, had exceeded the period of the existence of the Soviet Union. So we are in a period not seen in 100 years, is what Xi Jinping says, but we haven't had a kind of, and people can argue about whether or not China is socialist or not, but the point is there is a country that is an economic and political challenge to the unipolarity that has largely dominated our lifetime, right?
Since
and that hasn't
collapse.
since the collapse. So the moment we're in right now is what we wanted to try to look at closely and try to define.
How are you all defining imperialism? Because you talked about earlier how the imperialism that Lenin described is not really the imperialism of today. A lot of people just think it's when you have too much money. This is a very oversimplification. You have too much money in your nation, so you have to export it elsewhere. And that's how a lot of people think that China is imperialist, because they just have more money. They've had a surplus of capital that they need to export to other nations. So how do we understand imperialism today, and then what makes it you already kind of answered it, but what makes it a hyper-imperialism in this given moment, just so people are clear on those definitions?
Well, I mean, so imperialism, its birth and its genesis was of course in the colonial period, and 400 years ago, and it was able to, imperialism, the classic term, means that there's a certain financial, military, even technological monopoly over all the resources of the world, right? And that the benefit of those monopolies goes towards a small elite. Often it's hard to see, and it was hard for a lot of the European countries to understand that they were imperialist, because the lives of the ordinary people did marginally improve. There's certain social welfare programs that are opened up, etc. But all of that wealth comes from slavery. Like, we've had great studies come out in the last, decade or so that look at actually the tipping point in terms of the huge amounts of wealth and profit that they're able to amass comes from slavery, because essentially you're not paying the person, right?
Yeah.
It's just the most rampant form of exploitation. So you're extracting the most surplus value out of human laborers, right? But over the course of that time, we of course see a shift where, World War I, World War II is essentially about inter-imperialist rivalries, where people are fighting over, what they get to control, and in order for themselves and their elites to benefit.
It's important to know, even real quick, and even in World War I, for instance, Germany lost all its colonies that didn't go to France and other nations, other European nations. So just again, so people have an example of inter-imperialism, it wasn't that they were fighting for some kind of liberation. It was like the one country lost, and then their the colonies then go to another European country, right? Like that's a good example of it. Continue, sorry.
No, thanks. That's a good one. And so we do have, like, we categorize the stages so people can understand it clearly. There's towards the end of the section on defining imperialism, we categorize basically 5 key periods, which maybe also helps the listeners that, you know, between the 1890s to the First World War, we have modern imperialism rising. We then have the inter-imperialist war period of 1914 to 1919. But by 1917, with the birth of the Soviet Union, we're also seeing a decline in British hegemony, right? Their involvement in the wars, their overextension in different parts of the world, where they're having to also fight and quell anti-colonial rebellions. They're basically in an economic crisis by the end of the beginning of the Second World War. And so the landscape is shifting. We also see the Great Depression, which then, of course, affects the economic strength of the West. But after 1945 to 2008, this is the era where the US is basically increasing its strength and usurping a lot of the former imperialists. But again, the economic model was always going to come to this logical conclusion, because for those who don't know about capitalism, it's trying to, the most simple way to explain it is, you're trying to have infinite growth, infinite exploitation on finite resources.
Mm.
So the very logic of capitalism is to create fictitious things based on a very finite, set of resources, be they human or natural.
So somebody will suffer inevitably in that kind of equation. Yeah, a lot of people suffer. Yeah,
and it often is most clear externally from the country, but from what I've heard from the comrades in the United States is that people in the South are increasingly getting more and more poor. That a lot of people are living below the basics, standard of living, and their lives are increasingly, not only is income inequality more or increasing, but that people just are living the worst lives. Well, as I said, so
suicide rates are high or up, and just
shootings, drug addiction, etc. So all the psychoses are manifesting right now. And the fact is that the Western leaders do not have a plan. So they have this inheritance, this political and economic inheritance from their looting of the rest of the world and their subjugation of the rest of the world. They can no longer subject us in the same ways, because we have had certain gains from the national liberation period from the 60s, the 50s, etc. And they don't have that kind of secure economic resources that they had at the time during the period of the Cold War, because now China and others have emerged to provide alternatives for the rest of the world. And so in this period, we start to see that the US can actually no longer continue on unilaterally making decisions for the world. They don't have the economics.
This is the post-World War II period you're talking about?
The post-2008 period.
Okay.
So they go through from the 50s and 60s, the US slowly is in decline in pure economic terms. But it's a very gradual decline. Like, as I said, they're not generating they're not generating capital, they're importing capital. The domestic savings is decreasing. And so that eventually ends up with the 2008 financial crisis. And this is the first time I think everyone is really awakened to the fact that there's a structural problem, that the form of development, I say in quotes, that the US is espousing is not true development, because people are being left behind. But by I think it was 2008, also happens to be around the time, I think it was 2007, that China surpasses the US in terms of the share of the GDP. And so that economic indicator then basically starts the US panicking about what it's going to do. I mean, that's around the time, a few years later, we see the pivot to Asia, where now the US wants to assert itself more physically, more militarily in the region surrounding China, because
And
they're losing a lot of those domestic markets in Asia.
China wasn't that affected, I think you noted, by the 2008 crash, at least relative to the rest of the world. Is that correct?
Yes, because basically, John Ross is actually going to publish a paper on this soon, I hope. But he looks at, there's a certain percentage of investment that you need to make into your country to have steady economic growth. So if you want to grow just by like 2% and do so gradually, Bolivia actually did this. If you want 2% growth, there's a certain percentage of investment that you have to have and reinvest into your own economy. So China was slowly, the economic policy it was taking was to slowly have gradual 2%, growth each year continue, and it slowly then increased that percentage, where I think it was 5% was last year, whilst the US was less than 2% and has only been declining in its economic growth in the last several decades. And so because of China's economic policy, it wasn't like not affected by the 2008 crisis, but it had gradually been buffering itself and building its own economic sustainability. And so part of then the crisis for the US is, one, the system crashes. They realize that all these what was it called again? The derivatives that essentially
the derivative market, gambling against gambling.
We're basically people realize their economic policy has been to gamble on some real but many not real assets.
That's why it's gambling on gambling. Like it's
gambling on gambling.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. Yeah.
And so it's like China slowly has a steady economic growth from 2008 up until today, usurps the US in terms of the share of the world GDP, usurps the US in terms of the share of industry value added. The global South is also slowly seeing shifts because of this change in the balance of forces, as we like to say. And so as the US is declining, and as I said, in economic terms, it's also starting to lose political legitimacy, because now, we're now 3 decades or so into structural adjustment programs where African economies and, global South economies have been borrowing money in and are using that money that actually comes from their historical looting and colonialism, trying to finance their countries, but in the process are told, actually, you can't invest in social services. You can't use your resources for national development. You can't build roads. You can't, build schools, essentially. And so it's creating this cycle of economic violence in a lot of the global South. Whilst it's also not performing well, it's increasingly performing poorly in all economic indicators. And so what can it do but make sure it shifts and has a strong hegemonic military apparatus? And again, why we say decadence, the word decadence means, over the top, it means excess, is that the West ends up showing that, one, the economic policies they have, aka capitalist economic policies, will not and do not benefit the majority. They start to lose political legitimacy around the world and in their own countries. And the only way they can exert itself, and I'm glad you mentioned the invasion in Iraq and basically the US moving into the Middle East, because they need the oil if they want to continue on as they have been, going on as they have been. But they're from the late 90s to early 2000s, we're seeing the US invest heavily into all these foreign wars, so-called wars against terrorism, in quotes. But what they're doing in the process is they're slowly increasing their military budget and decreasing social spending and things that would actually benefit their people. So this is also part of where the hyper starts to kick in, because the priority is war as a solution to all things, not diplomacy, not social projects, not social development. And so it starts to lose the plot. And Vijay said this the other day in an interview with somebody, is that they just don't have a plan. Europe doesn't have independent plan of the US. If we showed how with Germany, it's hard to really identify a lot of ownership in terms of the stock exchange because it's purposefully, hidden and mired in, and opaque, right? But a large share of the German DAX, the stock exchange of Germany, is foreign owned. So it's like their own economy is, and by foreign owned, it can only be the US because Turkey is not able to, get on the DAX or the stock exchanges of the Western countries. So the point I'm trying to make is that from 2008, when we see that they don't have a good economic plan, there's the internal crisis of the rise of the Tea Party and other more right-wing conservative things that then bring us Trump, etc., bring us, 6th of January and all of that, there's this political vacuum as well. There's a political vacuum, and the only way that the US exerts itself is through military means. And that's also part of the decadence because they don't have a plan. I mean, do you think Macron has a plan for France? This is what Vijay was saying. People like Macron, people like Schultz, they don't seem to have a plan that's not essentially a concession to the US. And as we've seen, international bodies like the United Nations, etc., are also because ultimately US goes around vetoing everything that the rest of the world says no to. So it's acting illegally in a lot of the different operations it has worldwide. And the way, again, it interacts with the rest of the world is through various forms of coercion. If it's not outright violence, it's hybrid warfare, where we mentioned sanctions, economic embargoes, blacklisting people, intervening quietly into the economic policies, funding opposition groups. I mean, a lot of the progressive agendas in Africa were essentially undermined by CIA-backed coups. That's what happened in Ghana. That's what happened in Burkina Faso. And those were countries that wanted to have a continental sovereign modernization project that centered on people's needs. I hope folks will go and actually look at the study, because even though it's super massive long, there's some neat charts that help you to kind of visualize the world and how we organize them. For example, as the Global North, we organize it in 4 rings. At the core are the kind of US's strongest intelligence allies. They also happen to be the countries that have emerged out of white settler projects of colonialism. So it's the UK, Canada, Australia, Israel, and New Zealand. But they have the strongest intelligence networks historically. Most of them made agreements in the 50s and the 60s. Of course, Israel is the US's baby, so it continues to have the strongest military and economic and political ties. Then we have other countries that people also don't know. Countries like Sweden is in the second ring and the second layer of what we see as the global north. But countries like Sweden and Norway and Denmark, who are considered these the word they use in Denmark is hyggelig, which is like this like warm, cozy love of life, that are considered to be social democratic countries that have so-called progressive agendas, are highly integrated and have been highly integrated through, and Julian Assange, the journalist who led WikiLeaks and has exposed a lot of the lies and hidden activities of the US over the years, and who's continued to be politically persecuted. Him and WikiLeaks actually exposed these intelligence networks, what initially was the Five Eyes in the center of it, those settler states minus Israel, but now we add Israel. But it then created the Nine Eyes, where it integrated Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Germany. Then it created the 14 Eyes, where it integrated a few more countries. So I'm raising this because part of why we wanted to map out the world in this moment when China has emerged is we need to understand the tendencies of the global north. And I think we did a stronger job of characterizing the global north in terms of the intelligence, showing their military, showing the nature of their economic policies, etc. But we are at a bit of a weakness because the global south, in contrast, doesn't necessarily have an integrated it isn't an integrated bloc. We have some common things, like we all want sovereignty over our resources. We all want to develop our countries and modernize. We all want digital sovereignty, food sovereignty, but we largely are not organized around those kinds of demands, even though there are tendencies that bring certain countries in closer contact. So we group them in 6 groupings, is what we're calling them. And we broadly gave kind of general characteristics where we see the 6 groupings as follows. We have the socialist projects, and they vary. Laos is by no means the same kind of socialist project as China, as Cuba, etc. But they still have a workers'
And
party.
That's 6 countries, right? There's 6 countries in this ring.
Yes.
So that's that is who? That's China, Venezuela, Cuba, Laos, Vietnam, and I'm not remembering.
DPRK.
Yeah.
That's 1. 2, then we tried to look at, okay, well, there must be other tendencies that are useful for those who are fighting for, progressive agendas to understand. And we looked at countries like Brazil, South Africa, who's taken, the Israelis to the ICJ, Brazil, who has had Lula and others trying to lead progressive governments, Zimbabwe, who was sanctioned for trying to pursue its own economic development, as well as, Bolivia, many Latin American countries that come out of the pink tide that were trying to push for people-centered agendas. And I mean, even Namibia, who, has been very vocal in the last few years in their foreign policy around the fact that the West continues to act as a neo-colonial force in the world. The other groupings, which I'll just be brief about, the most interesting one is those who are strongly seeking sovereignty. And we put them as the second grouping because basically how we created our initial list was about who are the main enemies of the US right now. The socialists are the first enemy. The second are those who are fighting for sovereign development in some format, who want to do their own thing. And that is Russia, that is Iran, that's Burkina Faso, Mali, etc. They vary, but they nonetheless are the targets. If the US was looking at who are we going to do a regime change on, the socialists come first, those fighting for sovereignty come second, the progressive governments come third. Like right now, if the ANC loses South Africa and the DA comes in, which I don't think will happen, if the African National Congress loses and the Democratic Alliance comes in, the Democratic Alliance is essentially a white supremacist project that would undo the little gains we've gotten in the last
that's
few decades.
Just the recreated National Party, right?
Yes, it's just the Nationalist Party, the inheritance of the former apartheid leaders, essentially, who have only the interests of the white elite at their hearts.
Interesting name choice. Whenever I read that, the Democratic Alliance. So
yeah, we have lots of those going on around the world.
Yeah.
But then the fourth grouping we have is what we were calling the new non-aligned. We use the term new non-aligned, and it's made up of 5 countries. Sorry, India, Indonesia, Turkey, Mexico, and Saudi Arabia. They don't have a lot in common in terms of politics, but they are economies that are the fastest growing and rank in the top 20 global economies. So even though politics is not a zero-sum game of economics, we still need to understand that there are economic powerhouses that are changing the balance of forces in terms of who owns greater share of the world GDP and where that wealth is increasing and increasing rapidly. And the fifth grouping
before you jump to the next range, I just want to see, because I know some people are still in the influence that these are like boogeyman countries, particularly Iran or Russia or even the DPRK, and I know you have them in different blocks. So before you expand, could you just speak to what the process was for this, and how when you put these countries in these blocks, the way I understand it, this isn't a statement of these all being the revolutionary countries. Like you said at the beginning, this is more of a material analysis. So what do you say to someone who's like, well, Iran's a bad guy, or Russia, or even China, or whomever? Like, what do you like? How do you explain these blockings in relationship to that? And then you can just go ahead and finish those blockings, just for people
Sure.
who again may not have any sense of what we're talking about here.
Mhm. So, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things we just wanted to hit home is that there are not many imperialisms. There's only one imperialism that is led by the US. If we're going to challenge that imperialism, we need to understand who the US sees as its prime enemies and what are the reasons for that. One I mentioned was in terms of countries that might have, again, huge economies, progressive agendas, opposite politics, are fighting for their sovereignty, are heavily sanctioned. Like most of those in the strongly sovereign group are heavily sanctioned by the West.
Yeah, I think the document says the United States has sanctioned 1/4 of all countries in the world, which I don't think people realize just how ridiculous that is. But yeah.
Yeah, like a solid, I think it's a third of the world population lives under sanctions of some kind.
Yeah.
But the other is that some of these countries that are in the first two groups are countries that have some kind of nuclear capacity. And that is the zero sum for the US is how does it defeat any form of an enemy? It has to target those that can, because right now it only has military power or military hegemony. It has power in economic realms, but it's declining, as I mentioned earlier. But that if it wants to sustain its seat at the top of the pyramid, it also needs to eliminate its kind of possible military opponents. So China, Russia, DPRK, and Iran all have nuclear capacity. Then there are countries like Syria, Venezuela, and Cuba, and Belarus who don't really have that at all, but who represent certain political challenges because of various historical reasons. We know Venezuela and Cuba because of their socialism. We know Belarus is closely aligned to Russia, the only former, Soviet bloc or Eastern bloc that is still very much aligned with Russia. But basically them having nuclear or near nuclear, because it's not like 100% for many of them, is the prime issue for the United States, because it's only the US, the UK, France, and Israel that are actual nuclear powers with nuclear capacity. And so in order the US's geostrategic view of the world essentially is like, if we defeat these rising countries if we want to defeat them and we take the military route, we have to defeat those who have the greatest capacity to fight back. That's one. Two is that they haven't been able to control Eurasia. And Eurasian integration has been happening through the Belt and Road Initiative, through various bilateral government-to-government activities. And that integration means a bolstering of not only the political capacity for them to set their own agenda, but their economic integration, which means that the US will get less and less of a share of those markets, their historical markets that they've depended on. And so they need to control Eurasia, overthrow the socialists and the secondary targets who are fighting for sovereignty or national patriotic projects. And to do so, they have to denuclearize them and dismember a lot of those potential adversaries. So that's kind of, I think, partially responds to your question.
And so why I'm asking this more also as a devil's advocate question, but why is that bad that the United States is denuclearizing countries or subverting their independence? Because again, if these are bad guys, quote unquote, then why isn't it better that those countries are contained if they, oppress women or they have poor human rights records or, why is that actually a bad thing?
I mean, in the most basic, if we look at the United Nations Charter, which all of these countries are a member of, all nations have a right to self-determination. Why is it that the US should choose how we live our lives?
Right.
And most importantly, and let me jump a little bit then, because we by no means are advocating for, we do not share, Iran and China do not share the same politics.
Right.
Well, like, let's be 100% clear. And many of the people who worked on this document do not advocate for the oppression of women, for, religious state, or like an Islamic state, a religion-based state organization. We do not advocate for those things. But we have to understand that the enemy of my enemy is my friend at this stage. We don't, as I said earlier, we do not choose the conditions in which we enter the world. We have to operate with the fact and the reality of things as they are. And if we want to defeat the US, or at least defeat and start to make significant blows against the US hegemony or US-led hegemony over the world, and determine our own fates in our various nations that, again, we did not create. These were lines drawn in 1884 for some of us in Africa, but we nonetheless need to, we nonetheless have to operate in these conditions. Hopefully we'll get to that stage where we have a federated state of Africa, as Kwame Nkrumah had advocated for in the 60s. And in fact, in Africa, we would need to get to that stage of a more coordinated economic and political plan or association, because part of China's ability to grow the way it has is that it has an economy of scale quality. It has the scale to move at a rapid pace and mobilize resources in the commanding heights of their industries in ways that we can't do because we're balkanized in Africa. We would need to regionally coordinate if we really wanted to increase the productivity of our different sectors. If we wanted to industrialize, if we wanted to modernize, we can't, a little Malawi can't industrialize all on its own without having, proper infrastructure to get to the oceans, the Indian Ocean, right? And that will only happen if we are coordinated as nations. So that's one thing. But two is that, let's take the question of China. I was shocked. I'm now living in China. I'm working on research there at the moment, and around China-Africa stuff. And I'm actually hoping to do my PhD there. I was shocked that in 2021, when China announced that it had eradicated extreme poverty, basically that, people are not going hungry, people are not having to search for their next meal.
This was like 500 million people or so, right? Something of that nature.
800 million,
800 million.
Total.
Okay, so I was even,
Yeah, 800 million people.
That's not something to shrug off.
It's not something to shrug off, but the world shrugged it off. It wasn't headlines in a lot of the African media. If it was, it was kind of like, these statements that are said by the UN just to acknowledge it. But the quality of life in China has dramatically changed. When China was, stood up and liberated itself under the Communist Party, or under the leadership of the Communist Party in 1949, China was amongst the poorest countries in the world. The life expectancy at the time was 35 years old. Through the Mao period, by the late 70s, that number almost doubled. So one, socialism does actually improve people's lives because, life expectancy improved. That's one of the indicators most countries take seriously. But two, that in the last few decades, China, even though it's been rapidly economically growing, it hasn't left people behind. There is still a lot to work on. I've been across the countryside in southern China and eastern China. People are still working hard to improve standards of living, but extreme poverty has been eradicated, and that's, again, nothing to shrug off. And so in this moment, sorry, I'm blanking. Part of why I was raising this was, if you think that China is some kind of boogeyman or enemy, look at the concrete reality. The people have improved their lives significantly. They, are now, the GDP per capita has increased significantly. And even though they're like now just above, they're not in the, lower income developing countries. They're now in almost middle income status. They've the society has changed so rapidly, where we are having the highest levels of enrollment in education. Villages are living in much better conditions and are very interconnected because of the rapid infrastructural developments that have happened. If you take the high-speed railway from Beijing to Shanghai, it's a 4.5-hour trip, and it's a huge train of 1,000 people are on that train traveling, every 4 hours, every couple of hours are traveling back and forth, but it's spread across the country. And yes, there's still an imbalance in the sense that the East is more developed than the West, but huge steps are being taken to try to improve the lives of people and center people in the middle of it. I mean, I've never seen, for example, in Africa, actually not even in Africa, I was in New York City, when was it, last year in June? You're seeing old Black women who are having to beg on the street, who are walking around with trolleys, clearly homeless, clearly, not have malnourished, clearly basically devastated and in serious poverty. In China, one of the biggest shocks for me and for one of my other colleagues who comes from Africa was to see the high quality of life that retirees have. You see them in the weekends on Saturdays in these huge groups, singing in the park, playing instruments in the park, playing games, doing whatnot. But the quality of life has improved significantly. And if that is a project that is threatening the US, one in which is trying to improve the lives of its citizenry, we need to ask the questions of why the US has that priority of trying to take down a country that has eradicated extreme poverty and has, improved the quality of life of people. That becomes the real question. Because for those who are saying, oh, these are bad countries, one, look at China as an example of one that takes its citizens as its priority. And two, look at what the US has offered its own people. That's not the alternative. That surely should not be the benchmark, that people are taking out loans, working multiple jobs, you're in heavy debt from being a student, when you're a student who just has some political ideas, not even political ideas, a basic moral compass, and doesn't want to see Palestinians killed. You are beat up, you're expelled, you're criminalized, as what's happening across the US right now. That should not be the barometer of the kind of society we want, one. And two, that can't be the barometer of the leaders of the world we want. So even though a lot of our countries who are, standing up against the US don't necessarily have the best domestic policies. I mean, a lot of, friends in the LGBTQI plus community are like, well, look what Russia does in terms of criminalizing Black people, LGBTQI plus people. We also know that there are a lot of Russian oligarchs who are perfectly happy with, pursuing their economic interests in the global South and don't really care about the lives of the people in the global South. But if we do want to create space and opening, we do need to create many Vietnams, as Che Guevara said. We need to hit imperialism where it hurts. And these countries are trying to hit imperialism where it hurts through building different financial systems, doing different financial reforms. Right now, I think China and Russia, they more or less, they don't exchange goods in dollars. They do it in yuan and what's the Russian money? Rubles. We're also seeing
Rubles.
Yeah, so that's a form of fighting against the dollar domination, the Wall Street domination that hasn't provided any solutions for humanity.
In the document, and you kind of alluded to it earlier, the U.S. hegemony. I think part of why people get so confused about what's a bad country, one, is just propaganda of the United States, right? Like this, they just make everybody that doesn't fit their agenda seem like the worst country and the leaders are these boogeymen that don't talk to anybody else. They make unilateral decisions and they're dictators, and but also just on a historical level, the U.S. hegemony, the control over the dollar and using that as a way of disciplining the rest of the world. So, we know that the United States, after World War II, tied the gold standard to the U.S. dollar, and then in the 70s, got rid of the gold standard. And then that's how we get like what we call the petrodollar, and that's where we start seeing the major like just booming of financialization, where there's just all this fake money basically going around. Marx called it fictitious capital. So at that point, the United States moves from a creditor nation to a debtor nation. So what that means in layman terms, for people who may not follow all of this, is like the United States is forcing everybody else to circulate their dollars in their economy, and they're taking on and those other countries take on the debts of the United States, and that allows the United States to expand its military even more. And that's how we kind of get to this military expansion, even as the rest of the United States is on decline. So what that does, and then the Soviet Union falls, and then there becomes like this unipolar moment where the United States is able to dictate pretty much what most of the world is doing, other than a few countries, as you name, like such as China and such. And even once the Soviet Union fell, even initially, Russia and a lot of those countries that were within the Soviet Union, they, like I said earlier, they basically just carved them up. Russia eventually comes around and realizes this isn't even working for their own capitalist interests. So a lot of countries are just realizing that even for bourgeois interests, not just for some kind of national liberation, it's not, the United States is not allowing things to develop. So a lot of these other things that we have issues with, whether it be the way that LGBTQIA plus people are treated, the way women are treated, the way Africans are treated in, countries in which we're minorities, et cetera. Countries that are already sanctioned, already, barely making it, are not going to necessarily be in the best position to address a lot of those backwards social relations while under U.S. imperialism. So if you want those things to improve, some of those other issues, U.S. imperialism makes it harder. If a country is sanctioned and they're barely surviving and they're not getting the resources they need, it's probably not likely they're also going to work out their relationships with how they treat women or how they treat minorities or something. Like, it's not going to help. Removing a sanction is probably going to give that country more of an opportunity to struggle through those things. So I think seeing imperialism is like this primary contradiction, this primary thing that hovers over the rest of humanity, I think is important. Whenever we're discussing whatever other issues countries may have.
If we actually are going to develop, we do actually also need to look at countries like the new non-aligned who have enough scale, have enough like human capacity that they have reached and broken into the top 20 economies in the world. And Indonesia has also been doing interesting things there. They last minute decided not to, they withdrew their BRICS application, but nonetheless, they've been doing interesting things around the fact that they have put in a law where they are one of the biggest producers of nickel, for example. I think they have like 25% of world nickel comes from there. And it's a key, mineral or metal resource in technology. And what they've done is they've put a ban on the export of raw nickel, that it actually has to be processed. So if you are going to benefit from us, you have to come into our country and build some manufacturing capacity and, transform it from the raw material and add value, essentially. So that's some of the trends in the new non-aligned group. But then the two groups that are probably like the weakest is that we have the diverse global south, which essentially is 111 countries, where and a lot of them are small countries. I mean, what is Marshall Islands? What is their plan for their people? They're on such a small scale that it's harder for them to develop. There are many ways that they can have certain social gains, because the smaller the country, the lower expenses it is for things like, they normally have higher life expectancy in the islands versus in Central Africa, where you're not connected to the ocean and trade routes, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But the diverse global south, we need to get more precision around how we think about them. And maybe there are tendencies we've missed or that aren't at the forefront. But that is a big challenge, is just how diverse the global south is and how regionally not connected we are, and how we face many similar challenges of debt, of lack of financing, of shared histories of colonialism. But nonetheless, these are countries that, if brought together under platforms like some of the efforts of the BRICS agenda, etc., like some of the progressive elements to the African Union's documents, but that nonetheless have not fully been realized, these countries, we're going to have a big issue of how do we actually bring people together? I mean, the Global South is made of 145 countries. How are we going to coordinate that political cohesion for a minimum program? I mean, of course, that's a huge challenge. But the last grouping, just so folks know, is that we also have a sixth grouping, which the trend is that they're basically heavily US militarized, and that's the Philippines and South Korea, because they essentially act on behalf of the US. They have, a lot of military bases. They have been instrumental in many of the US and Western military and naval operations in the South China Sea. They continue to basically be stooges, for lack of a better word, or explicitly stooges. There are many African countries that are stooges of the US, but more explicit than most, right? And so the Global South, we created these six groupings, not because we think these are definitive and not because that they are inherent, but because they are something that we need to set our own agenda. And these are some of the tendencies or trends that we see in those countries. And I think it's relatively fluid. I mean, we had Angola in the historic progressive when we initially started it, but then Angola quietly left the Friends of the United Nations Charter, or in defense of the United Nations Charter. The reasons I'm not necessarily sure of, but then we had to consider, okay, maybe they have different interests that don't align with some of these new multilateral organizations. And in terms of, just on the boogeyman point, because I don't know if I fully answered it, but if I was to make it short, when I raised the question of China's internal development and the fact that 800 million people were lifted out of extreme poverty, the role clearly of the US, soft power machinery is clearly at work if we think that China is the boogeyman of the world, if we think that communism is the boogeyman of the world, because as we've already mentioned, the boogeyman is the one who has consistently gone and warred half of the world, or most of the world. The boogeyman is the one who increases military spending. The boogeyman is the one who supports, the kind of ethno-genocide of the Palestinian people, who kills people but based on their ethnicity, who demonizes Arab people, who creates all these. I mean, they created Hamas, and now that Hamas is doing its own thing, they want to say that they're the enemy. No, if the Palestinian people feel represented by Hamas, it's their sovereign right to self-determination. It's their sovereign right to self-determine, and you, as it says in the UN Charter, you're entitled to do so, to fight for your sovereignty and fight for your people. So, when people say these countries are the boogeyman, one, look at the concrete reality of who is creating the wars in the world, the crises of the world, the financial, economic, political crises of the world. And if you do so, you'll see that it wasn't China who started this thing, nor are they trying to engage in it. And B, that those who might not represent the interests of their people are nonetheless part of processes that are undermining the true enemy, which is US imperialism or US-led imperialism. And we have to consistently work towards weakening the US. Whatever we do, whoever's listening to this, our job right now for our lifetime is to weaken the US in any way we can, to weaken the US's economic, political, military hegemony over the world. That is our task. And sometimes it's not so obvious. Sometimes it's more complicated than that. But we need to deal the most significant blow we can to US imperialism if we are concerned, even marginally, with the survival of humanity and the survival of the earth.
Yeah, I think, or like is noted in the document, like the global north is is unified on a project. Like the global north, the 49 countries in the global north, they talk to each other, they share intelligence, they have military bases, particularly the United States, since it leads this bloc. And as you also noted, 74% of US or 74% of military spending comes out of is led by this bloc, which I still don't think is like we've really sat well enough with that fact. So you know that whole those are all those countries are coordinated. They're not just existing because they're not just you're not just putting them in the category because they're predominantly white or something. It's also that they actually have real working relationships, and I know Japan technically falls under that, even though they're not really a global. They're not technically in the global north. They work within that unit. So just for the global south, it's like there has coordination regardless of whether people all agree on stuff. You know, if you're trying to combat that, you have to have some coordination to go back at it. Otherwise, you are kind of at the, you know, you're kind of at the bottom of whatever the global north wants to do to you if you don't have that kind of coordination, you know.
And one thing I didn't say was that there is also a historical basis for the Global South in many different initiatives, whether it's the Bandung Conference in 1959, Afro-Asian Solidarity, whether it's the Non-Aligned Movement, whether it's the OSPAL, the Organization of Solidarity of the Peoples of Asia, Africa, Latin America, whether it's the new International Economic Order, which was, you know, on the heels of the defeat of Salvador Allende. The legacy of the Third World Project, we should also be studying that more seriously to understand what went wrong, what were the internal disputes that maybe undermined the project, what were the lessons from that period, because it's not as if we don't have a history of you know, internationalism, right? And internationalism based on national sovereignty, dignity of the people, etc. So part of our task is, whilst we're trying to look forward, we also should look back and really understand those processes, because there are ample lessons to learn from the many defeats, because some of them were very much coordinated by the US and the West and 100% undermined it. I mean, when Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown in 1966, I think it was, right? When Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown in
1965. 65 or 66, yeah. Yeah.
But when he was overthrown, this was when many African countries were only either just independent and only flag independence, as we call it. There were many countries that were still fighting for independence, but he was one of the key leaders leading a key process, not only in terms of Pan-Africanism, where he's making, you know, radical calls. He's also engaged in the international community. He was at the Bandung Conference. He's also working with national liberation leaders across the world. He's also doing big infrastructural development projects. The Akosombo Dam project, you know, they have this huge water resource. There were a lot of issues, contradictions. They had to work with Italian construction companies. They had to get some US financing. But the idea behind the project was it was going to be the dam to power Africa or power West Africa. And it had the potential to do so. And Ghana is one of the few countries in Africa that doesn't have as many electricity problems. But the lessons from Ghana is that they initially had wanted to use the energy from the dam, the hydropower, essentially to build certain manufacturing capacities for some of their key mineral resources. But they were objective things that they couldn't control, like the price of aluminium dropped seriously in the period of time, that they had a huge public debt, but that public debt was still funding infrastructural projects, right? Building roads, building schools. I mean, even before Ghana was officially free, a huge part of Nkrumah's contribution was they were building schools, they were educating trainers, they were sending people to the Soviet Union to get trained in the hard sciences, in engineering, so that they could, again, determine their own path, you know? But I'm giving such a detailed thing about the example is to say that when we lose Ghana, for example, that creates a huge hole, not only an ideological hole, but also of a country who was experimenting and attempting to modernize on their own terms within the limitations of the international financial system and the stage of imperialism that they were in. And so studying those moments helps us to understand what we are up against and what complexities we need to be aware of. So again, when the opportunities come, we understand the kind of regional, continental, international processes that would also need to be built simultaneously as the national project. So I think that the basis for the Global South, there is history there. There is underlying potentiality, but with the Belt and Road Initiative and the increased infrastructural projects, we are more and more integrated than we have been. Even though we don't control the digital space, we at least can access each other. And like, we need to learn from the people who are on the cutting edge. I mean, the Great Wall of China is actually their firewall, because they've been able to have some extent of digital sovereignty. They have all their own apps, all their own, their data is not being tracked and manipulated to fight against, for the US to fight against China, etc. So they've created these types of steps. So we should not only learn from the past, but we should learn from those who are developing some sovereign projects and processes. So we're not lost per se, even though we are a diverse, eclectic group who are not integrated in the way we operate.
All right, that is all. Again, we'll see y'all for part 2, where we will get more in depth into some of the implications of what was laid out in part 1, as far as on the negative side, obviously, there's a lot to be worried about, but also some of the positives and what we can do as a global, people to address the hyper-imperialist challenges that we face and what some of those options are. So we hope to get to that. Again, I hope y'all enjoyed. I hope y'all learned. I know there was a lot of stats and graphs and all that, but I hope it made sense. And if not, we'll improve. But thank y'all for coming through. See y'all next time.
Okay. Fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be